In Part 7 of Why Was the Third Earliest Party in the United States Opposed to Freemasonry, we will cover the search for an anti-Masonic presidential candidate, the ending of the Morgan trials, the first national anti-Masonic convention, and the creation of the first presidential nomination convention. If you haven't already seen Parts 1 through 6, you should do that now and come back here later. Look for the tabs at the top of this page. If you're still here, welcome back to my channel where I question history as we know it. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you do, you know what to do. In February of 1831, the purists of the Anti-Masonic Party held a state convention at Albany, resolving to renew their promise to not support any Freemason for office under any circumstances. Naturally, they wanted to keep the party on track with its namesake, but the realists, or the weed and seaward inner circle, wanted someone who could potentially beat Andrew Jackson in the race, which most would say was their intention with the party all along. To them, Henry Clay was this man, but to the purists this would not do, as Clay was a Mason and had even been the Grand Lodge Master of Kentucky from 1820 to 1821. Clay did attempt to appease the antis, saying he had resigned from his lodge due to the lack of interest in 1824, and had been inactive for many years. But this was not enough, and at the February convention, a Poughkeepsie delegate accused Weed and friends of publicly supporting Masons. Attempting to appease the group, the New York leaders began considering other men. Meanwhile, the trials connected to the Morgan affair were coming to an end. At the Special Circuit Court in March of 1831, several men were tried, but none were convicted. Elisha Adams, accused of perjury, which according to Weed's autobiography he was absolutely guilty of, went to trial and was acquitted. One account says that 11 of the 12 jurors selected said he was guilty, but one juror, a Mason, held out long enough that eventually the whole jury was dismissed. Similarly, two other Masons, Solomon C. Wright and Jeremiah Brown, had been indicted for perjury but were also acquitted. The anti-Masons claimed that 10 of the 12 jurors wanted to convict, but the two that refused vowed to hold out until the bitter end. After 36 hours, everyone was surprised by the jury's verdict of not guilty. The statute allowing for a special counsel over the Morgan trials expired in May of 1831 and was not renewed by the New York Grand Assembly, even though there were still at least 4 outstanding indictments at the time. Further trials could have occurred without a special counsel, but essentially people believed it would be pointless, and so they didn't. All in all, the Morgan affair consisted of 5 years' worth of investigations, resulting in 20 grand juries and 18 trials, with a total of 54 Freemasons indicted. 39 of those came to trial, and 10 of those who were tried were convicted, the worst of which being kidnapping. Adding deathbed confessions and eyewitness testimony, historian William Preston Vaughn in his book The Anti-Masonic Party declares that as many as 69 Masons were involved in Morgan's disappearance. Back in the political sphere, the leaders of the Anti-Masonic Party were searching for their presidential candidate, and they briefly considered Richard Rush. Richard was the son of Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and at this point he had already served as the Attorney General of Pennsylvania and then of the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and had even run as John Quincy Adams vice president in the previous election. He is questioned by the anti-Masonic committees on his opinions of Freemasonry, and he responds with a couple of publicized letters in May and June of 1831. He admits that he had been initiated years earlier into the craft, but states that he had only attended Lodge one other time after this and withdrew voluntarily by letter in 1826, supposedly before Morgan's abduction. In the letters, he vehemently declares his opposition to Freemasonry, expressing an urgent tone and a strong belief in the need to take action against the institution, which he regarded as, quote, a subversive force and the greatest contemporary danger to American liberties. He accused the institution of attempting to preserve itself rather than follow the laws of justice and morality, using its long-standing history as a shield against accountability, and urges for the dissolution of the fraternity, while also highlighting the ethical and moral failures of the press in the face of Freemasonry's influence. Even though Rush appears to prioritize the eradication of Freemasonry above all other political considerations, the New York party leaders could not agree on Rush and were questioning his reliability. Living up to this reputation, when the leading anti-Masons in Pennsylvania expressed their desire to have his name considered among those from which a presidential candidate would be selected in September, he declined, stating that he had made his public statements about Freemasonry without the expectation of being nominated to any public office. He says he believes that accepting the nomination would raise doubt about his motives and detract from the sincerity of his stance against Masonry. Ironically, because his letters were so passionate and so incensed a call to action, it seems unbelievable that he would back out of allowing his name to assist in the cause. And thus it raises doubts about his motives and distracts from his sincerity on the subject. I mean, the support he had already drummed up on the subject can hardly be calculated. To then just let his involvement fizzle out like that is just weird to me. There's so much more going on here at this moment in time, obviously, that I cannot get into all of it at the moment. But to summarize the rest of Richard Rush's anti-Masonic career, he's nominated on an anti-Masonic ticket for Senator of Pennsylvania in December of 1831, but he's not elected, and by the time of the presidential election, he's completely switched over to the Jackson Party. Side note, if you've seen the first video on this channel, you may remember Rush from it, where in 1836, Jackson sends him to England to secure the money left by James Smithson to establish the Smithsonian Institution. And to add to that, Rush also later becomes one of the regents of the Smithsonian Institution. It's a fascinating story. If you want to check it out later, there's a link at the top of this page or in the description box. Anyway, back to our current story. By September of 1831, the Antis were still undecided on their candidate, and they approached 76-year-old Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. He had been a Grand Master of the Virginia Lodge from 1793 to 1795, and thought Masonry was harmless up until sometime after 1826. He did agree to attend the Baltimore Convention, but only as a spectator, and refused to allow his name to be placed for nomination. And so the search continued. The Anti-Masons held their first national convention in Philadelphia on September 11, 1831. 96 delegates from 10 states and 1 territory were in attendance. In one account, it states that the planners had asked to use Independence Hall for the event, but were denied permission. And of course, the Antis believed that this was the result of Masonic influence over the building. The event was mostly led by the New York delegates, with William C. Wirt as president. Weed worked in an unofficial capacity, but was still heavily involved. John Spencer, who had previously been a defense lawyer for the Masons in the first case and selected as the special attorney in charge of the Morgan investigations, presented his report to the convention. The event lasted 6 days, and though the purists and the realists argued about whether or not to nominate a presidential candidate at all, nominating committees were formed, and specifically one to detail when, where, and how nominating a presidential candidate could be done. It was determined that a second national convention should be held September 26th in Baltimore to nominate candidates for president and for vice president. Of course, John Quincy Adams was strongly supported by Antis from his home state of Massachusetts, and they encouraged him to go for the nomination. But over and over again in his diary, he states that he does not wish to be involved in the presidential election. His son Charles worries about the consequences if John Quincy states his opinions about Masonry, but John Quincy writes that he's gone 5 long years without stating anything about the Masonic controversy, but that there comes a time when a man has to pick a side. He had of course read Rush's letters on the subject, and was disappointed to hear that he had not accepted the Antis' nomination. John Quincy would begin writing a series of his own anti-Masonic letters, spurred on during this time period from one address that attempted to use the name of his father, John Adams, in defense of Masonry. These letters were eventually published, and you can find the links in the description box below if you're interested in reading those. Weed, Seward, and friends had been focused heavily on John McLean at this point for the presidential nominee, but he had previously been asked to express his views on Masonry, and his response was consistently apathetic, claiming that he was, quote, not acquainted with the principles of Masonry, so he could neither approve nor condone them. Antis from New York and Ohio continued to hope that he would condemn Freemasonry and accept the nomination. Seward visited John Quincy at his home on September 14th, hoping for help with endorsing John McLean, since Massachusetts and Rhode Island supported John Quincy Adams. Adams wrote in his diary that he had stated he was afraid the Antis would not be able to unanimously agree on their candidate. Seward wrote to Weed later, stating that after 3 laborious hours of conversation, he had learned that Adams didn't really like McLean, and that he really wanted the nomination for himself. Seward said the New York Antis cannot let that happen, believing it would have, quote, disastrous effects. Most of the delegates were under the impression when coming to the convention on the 26th that they would be voting for McLean specifically. However, at the last minute he withdrew, stating that there were already enough candidates and he would just be more of a distraction.
In view of this, the party leaders began acting out of sheer desperation. This meant that they had to make a genuine choice in the moment, and that this would transform the meeting into what we now recognize as a nominating convention, introducing procedures like delegate credentials checks, designated seating for press, and the adoption of a 3/4 rule for nominations. Luckily, the side of the respected Judge John Marshall impressed another onlooker, former Attorney General William Wirt of Maryland. He had been appointed Attorney General by President James Monroe in 1818 and held the position until 1829 through John Quincy Adams' presidency. Side fact, he still holds the record for the longest tenure in U.S. history as Attorney General. Wirt had only visited the convention because he lived in Baltimore. He was well dressed and apparently been given a copy of the proceedings to look over, and wrote that if Masonry described in the proceedings was correct, then it ought to be destroyed. But this was not the Masonry he had been aware of previously in the South. Weed and Seward frantically went about trying to get everyone on board with nominating Wirt. Finally, on September 28th, the first nominating convention in American history took place, and the delegates decided on Wirt, although not everyone was happy. Even Wirt himself voiced doubts immediately upon being selected, with only his distaste of Andrew Jackson giving him the will to accept the nomination, hoping it would unite the Antis and the National Republicans. In his acceptance speech, Wirt was as honest as he could be, stating that he was honored but had not sought the nomination, was completely surprised by it, and dreaded the idea of actually holding the position. He admitted that he'd been initiated to a lodge early on and completed the 2nd degree, but had lacked the interest to continue further. He said that the Masonry of the Morgan trials was not the same as the harmless institution he had witnessed, and that surely it was not the Masonry Washington was involved in. He thought that men who'd carried out the conspiracy had taken the oaths literally, and that he couldn't believe that so many good men he had encountered who called themselves Masons would take these wicked oaths and consider them above their God and country. He was impressed with anti-Masonry's determinations, and stated that this goal must be carried out by all appropriate means. He ended his speech by stating that if the Antis wished to nominate someone else based on his views, he understood, and that would bring him more joy than accepting the nomination did. Many anti-Masons were shocked by his statements, but the New York leadership continued to force that the decision was unanimous. From day one, Wirt was the most reluctant and unwilling candidate potentially in U.S. history. The Nationals' party reaction to Wirt's nomination was similar to his own, surprise and disbelief. Within a few days, it felt obvious that he was not going to win all of their support, and he felt he had made a major mistake. Between October of 1831 and February of 1832, Wirt tried unsuccessfully to remove himself from the election. By May of 1832, he was feeling, quote, weary and sick about the whole thing. Hoping to be released from the nomination, he did not participate in the campaign, which consisted almost completely of editorials in local newspapers and speeches at state conventions. In his private correspondences, he wrote against Masonry and Andrew Jackson with passion. In one letter, he even declared the purpose of Masonry was to create an internal organization controlled by Europe. However, none of these comments were published. As the day of the election drew near, Wirt had already resigned to his and Clay's defeat, blaming the Antis for not helping unite the anti-Jacksonian forces, stating that with the purists and the realists each fighting for their own cause, how could they possibly expect to win? New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio arranged for joint electoral tickets between the Nationals and the Antis, attempting to unite against Jackson, but only stood to increase the distrust among the two factions of anti-Masons. Unsurprisingly, Wirt was defeated, and Andrew Jackson kept the presidency for another term, this time with the little magician Martin Van Buren as his vice president. After the campaign, Wirt seemingly thought that the anti-Masonry thus far had succeeded in taking down Masonry, suggesting publicly that if left alone, the institution would fade out of existence. But ultimately, it was Wirt himself that was fading. Already in poor health, he caught a cold in February of 1834 and died shortly after. President Jackson and members of the cabinet and Supreme Court and other dignitaries attended his funeral. The next day, John Quincy Adams gave a moving eulogy in the House of Representatives. In a similar political drama as Wirt's, the Antis from John Quincy Adams' home state of Massachusetts had nominated him for governor at the state convention in September of 1833. In his letter of acceptance, he stated that he must carry out his duty as a citizen, but in his diary, he expressed his regret that he would be cast, quote, again upon the stormy ocean of political electioneering which I had hoped and believed I was snug in port. Secretly, he thought he would also get the endorsement of the Nationals, who would meet in October. But it seems the Nationals at this point regarded John Quincy Adams as a traitor, in part by the letters he had been writing, and pledged themselves to John Davis instead. After this, Adams attempted to withdraw from the election without success, and Davis was chosen in the end. After the defeat of the 1832 presidential election, it was becoming clear that Weed, Seward, and friends were abandoning anti-Masonry and attempting to create a new organization. They considered the party to be too weak to hold a state convention in 1833, and in Seward's address of the minority of the members of the legislation in 1834, he did not mention Masons or anti-Masons at all. Most anti-Masons made a rapid transition over to the new Whig Party, created as a coalition against Andrew Jackson. But of course, the purists were furious and accused Weed and Seward of betrayal. Some even accused the New York leadership of accomplishing nothing at all. Weed and allies could justify the merger, however, as Masonry was nearly extinct in most of the state, and anti-Masonry was clearly losing public interest based on the election, and it appeared that the National Republicans and anti-Masons were in agreement on general issues of the day, not to mention their hatred of Andrew Jackson and friends. In the winter of 1834, the anti-Mason leadership met in Albany and agreed to dissolve the party. By April, Weed was using the term Whig in his journal, and in September, the Whig Party held its first state convention where Seward was nominated for governor. Big shout out to Albert and Laura for joining my Patreon. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing all of your comments. If you are interested in becoming a member and want your shout out, check out the link in the description box below. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Part 8 coming up next.